Overall, the Harry Potter films I would describe as kinda all over the place, honestly. Maybe one day I'll make a video analyzing these films in depth, but for now I'll give my abridged hot takes. The Philosopher's Stone is cute but meh, the Chamber of Secrets is meh, the Prisoner of Azkaban is fantastic, the Goblet of Fire is kinda shite.
You put your name in the Goblet of Fire.
The Order of the Phoenix is ambitious. The Half-Blood Prince has a solid climax and ending, but is overall kind of underwhelming. The Deathly Hallows Part 1 is emotional, but a little slow, and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 is a pretty damn good conclusion to the series. I'm gonna be spoiling Harry Potter this whole time, by the way, so if you don't want that, just skip this segment, I guess. So, obviously it's difficult to pinpoint where I stand with these films overall, since they vary in quality so much. And just to clarify, I don't think any of these movies are straight up bad, which is actually quite impressive considering that there's 8 of them. The problem, outlined by many viewers, is instead the tonal inconsistency. This series changes in style and tone completely various times as directors come and go. Obviously the books change their tone as well, in a way aging with Harry. In The Philosopher's Stone, the worst thing that might happen to a character is that they trip on a broomstick or something. In the Deathly Hallows, JK decides that if there's one thing she hates even more than her reputation, it's her side characters. So in the Battle of Hogwarts, she decides to temporarily turn everything into the Red Wedding and kill them all. When translated to film, this huge tonal shift from book 1 to book 7 risks being significantly more jarring than it was when it was in written form. Now, suddenly the music, cinematography, acting, and everything in between has to reflect this tonal change. And when it's on display like this, suddenly the shift is much more obvious and doesn't seem to flow as well. I mean, just look at how fun and colorful and happy-go-lucky these first 2 movies look. And then compare that shit to the last 2 movies.
Your parents are dead! You have no family!
This doesn't feel like the same series, but hold the phone for a second. We're gonna look at this from every angle, and you know what? One could make the argument that this shifting tone is actually a selling point of the movies. Think about it, how often is it that you watch a series that seems to grow up with its main character? I mean, sure, it might be a little jarring to go from films 2 to 3 or 4 to 5, where the tone of the world suddenly changes, but growing up can be sudden and jarring. I mean, you just wake up one day with hair growing on your balls. I mean, what are you supposed to do about that? There's no going back. So what's my opinion? Do I like the jarring tonal changes or dislike them? I mean, I don't want to give a cop-out answer, but I kind of understand both sides of the argument on this one. I like that the directing and writing style actually grows up with Harry a lot, and it makes these films a lot more interesting than if they were just one flat tone the whole time. Though I think it could have been done a little bit more smoothly and more gradually, as opposed to happening suddenly every time a director changed. However, something that I think I can safely say is an issue with these films is that they are forced to jettison a lot of detail from the books in order to cram everything into a 2-hour family film. Now, every film adaptation faces this issue to at least some extent, but think about how important the detailed world was to the Harry Potter books. The reason the Harry Potter books blew up at all isn't because of the fight between Harry and Voldemort, it's because of the world that that fight takes place in. It's because people fell in love with the idea of a school like Hogwarts, or all the creative spells and potions that J.K. Rowling conjured up. The books spend a lot of time on Harry just fucking around in Hogsmeade or playing Quidditch, even though Quidditch makes no goddamn sense. But readers lapped that shit up anyways. Why? Because they're charming world-building moments. And above anything else, even characters, that's what these books are famous for. In the films, many of these little world-building moments or character interactions that we may have taken for granted in the books are suddenly gone, and when added up, we truly feel their loss. Harry's friendship with Ron and Hermione, for instance, is much more convincing and fleshed out in the books when they have more time to interact like fellow humans, instead of being whisked from important plot point to important plot point. Now, to be fair, these friendships aren't written terribly in the movies. We do still see certain tender moments which help make these friendships feel more real, but it's just not as good as it is in the books. An example could be Hermione's Tumblr activism to free all house elves from slavery despite her not understanding anything about them. You see, they actually like being enslaved. It results in some pretty damn funny moments, especially when Ron starts making fun of her for it. It wasn't deemed important enough when Goblet of Fire was being adapted to film, however, so it was cut. It also played a big part in the Order of the Phoenix book, but it was cut from the film adaptation of that book as well. The opening of the 6th Harry Potter book strives to expand the connection between the magical and non-magical world of Britain by having the Minister of Magic routinely meet with the Prime Minister of Britain, which I thought was a funny idea, and a great world-building moment that sheds some light on how the magical and non-magical worlds coordinate with each other to avoid discovery. But again, since it's not crucial to the plot, this is nowhere to be found in the Half-Blood Prince film. I will admit that it doesn't make the most sense when you think about it. I mean, the wizarding world has been trying to hide itself from non-magical people for its entire existence, out of fear of being persecuted.
You have risked the exposure of our world.
And yet, they decide that the one person that they want to tell is the Prime Minister of Britain, aka a guy who has nukes and is probably the worst person you could possibly tell. If you're scared of someone interfering. Does Boris know about the wizarding world? Holy shit, that's why he knew how to cast those spells.
Right, honourable gentlemen, all up and let me put up taxes.
Okay, on some level I understand why they cut it now. Also, Harry's relationship with Sirius is badly underplayed in the 4th film, and to some extent the 5th film, which makes it a lot less impactful when he dies than it is in the books. But worst of all, they didn't include Peeves, okay? Even the CD-ROM games included Peeves. The fuck's wrong with you, Christopher Columbus? Cuts made to the story sometimes didn't only leave the wizarding world feeling less vibrant, but they sometimes left out crucial information. Again, in the Order of the Phoenix, Sirius gives Harry a magical two-way mirror before he dies, but again, it's cut for time in the movie adaptation. However, that mirror becomes an incredibly important plot point 2 books later in the Deathly Hallows, which came out 10 days after the Order of the Phoenix movie. And since J.K. Rowling never knows what she's gonna do before she does it, she didn't warn Warner Bros. In time to include the mirror. So, uh-oh, a super important MacGuffin is missing from the story completely. A MacGuffin that in the books literally saves Harry and everyone's life at one point. What do we do? Well, David Yates thought about it, and he came up with the solution. How about we just insert it into the Deathly Hallows Part 1 and hope people read the books? It's not the greatest solution, I'll be honest. Not even a significant line of exposition to explain where the mirror came from. If you hadn't read the books before watching this, you'd have no idea where this mirror came from or what its significance is. If I ever watch this film with someone who hasn't read the books, I'll have to stop and explain to them where the mirror came from, because they wouldn't know. When a viewer of your adaptation has to be familiar with the original source material to understand what's happening, you've messed up your adaptation. Even with these problems, I can certainly admit that the Harry Potter films hold on to one crucial element of the books, that being that they're fun. These films are undeniably entertaining and fast-paced, which a child-friendly story such as this honestly couldn't survive not being. Could you imagine if these movies were like the Percy Jackson films? That being said, there are several elements of the story that I truly believe are genuinely improved upon in the films. One of the most crucial improvements made to the story comes in the form of Severus Snape. I don't know how many other people feel this way, but in the books, Snape is an arrogant, immature, absolute bitch. He's perfectly willing to let James and an infant Harry die until Dumbledore scolds him about it and he folds. He bullies 11-year-old children because he had beef with their dead parents like 30 years ago. He can't even control his temper when anyone even slightly criticizes him. People defend this character as if he's 100% redeemed by dying to take down Voldemort. But I'm sorry. He's not. It was cool of him to do and all, but it doesn't instantly make him not a piece of shit. The Snape we see in the films, however, is crucially different. He still dislikes Harry, but not in nearly as much of a childish, immature fashion. Now, instead of being a straight-up bully, he's more of a cold and calculating figure. This mystique and composure especially helps him feel like a believable red herring villain, which he is painted as twice throughout the series. In the Prisoner of Azkaban book, Snape loses his mind and throws a giant temper tantrum when he finds out Harry isn't getting in trouble. "They helped him escape, I know it," Snape howled, pointing at Harry and Hermione. His face was twisted, spit was flying from his mouth. "Calm down, man," Fudge barked. "You're talking nonsense." "You don't know, Potter!" shrieked Snape. "He did it! I know he did it!" Whilst meanwhile the film version of him doesn't even show up, presumably because he's actually pursuing Sirius Black, who he genuinely believes to be a mass murderer, making his actions fairly justified. In the very same book, out of anger, Snape sabotages Lupin's career by telling everyone that he's secretly a werewolf. But in the movies, there's no mention of Snape having anything to do with Lupin's sacking. Also, earlier in the same film, there's this moment here when Snape protects Harry, Ron, and Hermione from danger, showing that he's actually an adult and not a bitter man-child like he is in the books. Later on in the series, there's a part when Snape is giving Harry occlumency lessons. Harry, not giving a fuck as usual, decides to take a glimpse into Snape's past, and sees that he used to be a My Chemical Romance fan when he was a teen, and got bullied, deservedly so. This understandably infuriates Snape since he didn't want anyone to know about that period in his life. In the movie, he hadn't been being very pleasant to Harry before he did this, but once Harry sees his past, he's just kind of left speechless and coldly tells him to get out of his office.
Your lessons are at an end. Get out.
It shows that there's a vulnerable side of Snape, and that there are things in his past which hurt him enough that they don't result in explosive anger, but worse, emptiness and sadness. Such as getting sexually harassed by Harry's dad.
Who wants to see me take off Snively's trousers?
Which is rare for this character. But in the book version of this scene, he completely loses his mind, screaming and throwing stuff at Harry until he has to run out of the room. This might also theoretically be impactful if Snape hadn't already done it multiple times before, but as it is, it just once again makes Snape seem kind of unhinged. All of these changes make Snape come across as rather more clever and intimidating in the movies. And I mean, he's still supposed to be smart in the books, but the movies just do a way better job of selling that. Snape is supposed to be good enough at controlling his thoughts and concealing his emotions that he can fool Voldemort, who's supposed to be the most skilled mind reader in the entire world.
Severus, please. We're friends.
And yet, he can't control himself when he gets a little mad. In the movies, he's still kind of a dick, yes, but impressively his character is far more nuanced, even with far fewer lines. Also, they cut the garbage from the 5th book where Cho and Harry exchange painfully bad dialogue about Cedric in a cafe over and over and over again, and it always ends with Cho crying in the most cartoonish fashion. Good riddance. Overall, the Harry Potter films are definitely a mixed bag, and they're probably still not as good as the books, even with certain improvements, but at least they capture the soul of the original story. Even the cuts that were made, which do harm the story, I mean, kind of had to be there unless all these films were going to be 5 hours long, because books are just way fucking longer than movies are. So honestly, I can't even really blame the writers for a lot of these. Like, it's not their fault they didn't include the mirror. I mean, JK really gave them no heads up at all. I dare to say that given what they had, they actually did a pretty good job deciding what to cut and what to keep, for the most part. I'm looking at you, Goblet of Fire. At the end of the day, I can tell these movies were still made by a talented team who had passion for what they were doing. But hold on a second. What if you were to take a similarly talented and passionate team and gave them a source material that fundamentally does not work in the medium it's being shoved into? Well, you may have heard by now of Netflix's 2019 adaptation of The Witcher, which still hasn't had a fucking season 2. This is an adaptation of a book titled The Last Wish. However, since the series was popularized by The Witcher video games, the TV adaptation obviously draws a lot of influence from those as well. A lot of people really like the first season of the show. I understand to some extent why, but I can't say that I agree. The casting, costumes, and sets are all pretty good, I won't deny the show that, but it's in the writing department where this adaptation falters. Now, The Last Wish is packed with a lot of dense subplots. In fact, it's not even a linear story, but rather a collection of shorts following a Witcher named Geralt, as he pursues various contracts. This style of book makes for a great video game adaptation because all of those separate, unconnected contracts / personal issues that Geralt has to take care of can be included as different quests, whether they be main story quests or side quests, to be explored at a player's leisure. Now, Now, the games are technically sequels to the books, as opposed to a directly faithful adaptation, but a great deal of the quests are heavily based off plots from the books with the same characters and beats in many cases, so I still count it. All the detail from the book helps make the world of the Witcher games feel rich, but the open-ended nature of the video game benefits it further. In this form, many less important but still interesting or world-building chunks of the book are optional, but not mandatory, meaning they still add to the richness of the world and the game, but the main story is able to operate trimmed of all this fat if you so desire. Also, in a video game, there is a lot more leniency for a quest to meander from the main plot, since not only are they far longer, but also what matters in a video game first and foremost is how fun the game is. And the creative settings of the different contracts make for a variety of pretty damn fun adventures wrapped up in an intriguing lore. It's satisfying to grind side quests and slowly level up my gear and shit, even if it has nothing to do with what's important right now. Like, fuck fighting the wild hunt at Kaer Morhen. I wanna go play Gwent for 5 hours and win 9,000 crowns. Sorry, Siri. What the fuck? This bitch stole half my crowns! Whilst a book of short stories works wonders whilst adapted, albeit loosely, into a video game, the same cannot be said for a TV show with a linear storyline. Because now all those side quest tier diversions from the main story are just gonna feel annoying. And on top of that, like I mentioned earlier when talking about video games as opposed to film, the games possess an interactive element that the show cannot. Now, I've only played the third Witcher game, like a fucking normie, I know, but I can attest to the fact that throughout the game there is a slew of highly important decisions which affects everything going forward. Oh, what's that? You killed Kira? Well, I guess she's not going to be helping you at the Battle of Kaer Morhen, but if you hadn't killed her, she would be there, and she would be of great use. Oh, what's that? You decided to have 2 girlfriends at the same time? Good job, Geralt, now they both hate you.
You just got exactly what you deserve.
Good luck finding love now. But if you'd picked just one, you would have had a happily ever after. The ending of the game is entirely decided by decisions you made, clans you supported, kings you killed, people you helped. Doesn't matter that the source material being adapted isn't a linear story, because neither is this. But again, Netflix's version of The Witcher is. So all of this input from the player, or viewer I guess, is gone, which wouldn't be as much of a problem if the final product wasn't so disjointed. The Lord of the Rings movies don't need interactivity from the viewer because they showcase one continuous strong story that builds on itself with characters that you care about. Just take a look at the first episode of the series. This is the pilot, so its main job should be to set up the world and the characters, and to kick the plot into motion. The first episode of The Witcher, however, sees Geralt partake in a side quest where he protects a scumbag wizard from a gang of outlaws led by a vigilante named Renfri. I have 2 things to say on this point. One, I do kind of understand why they picked this for the pilot, since it sets up what life is like for Geralt and also establishes him as the Butcher of Blaviken, which is a nickname he keeps forever. But it's still just a self-contained story that's completely irrelevant to the big picture. The fact that you could completely skip every Geralt scene from this episode and not be lacking any crucial information going forward is not a great sign. And 2, the significance that this encounter held in the book is completely butchered. No pun intended. What I'm about to say is outlined in way better detail by the closer look, so if you're interested, watch that video. It is a great video, and I'm about to rip it the fuck off. In the book, Renfri plans to kill every single inhabitant of a marketplace in order to guilt the wizard out of his tower so that she can kill him. Even though the wizard is awful, Geralt picks the lesser evil and decides to try to defeat her and her gang, but all that results from this decision is unnecessary bloodshed and Geralt getting brutally stoned by the town. It's revealed that Renfri never actually intended to butcher the market because she knew that the wizard would never leave his tower. She was just desperately trying to trick him into leaving. If Geralt had simply washed his hands of the situation, the outcome would have been better for everyone. The moral here is that sometimes it's better not to get involved with something that's morally questionable to begin with. It's better not to pick the lesser evil if the action itself is evil, or at least close. Alternatively, in the show, Renfri's apparent plan to hold the marketplace hostage is never mentioned. Not even once. This not only makes it super confusing as to why Geralt goes charging into the marketplace to fight them in the first place,
the market,
but the moral of the story will most likely be lost on any viewer. The unnecessary death of Renfri and subsequent stoning of Geralt by people who now hate him doesn't feel tragic and like it's the result of Geralt getting involved when he shouldn't have, but rather like Geralt just got by an evil wizard.
You made a choice, and you'll never know if it was the right one.
and now the stupid townspeople hate him because they're stupid. Many of the other stories throughout the season are adapted better than this one, but the trend of stories feeling unnecessary continues. Various parts of The Witcher just feel like, well, pointless side quests. Because that's literally what they are. Which are fun in a game, when they're optional, and you get a reward for doing them, but when they're shoved into the main plot of a show, it just feels meandering. And the worst part is that they didn't even do that terrible of a job considering how impossible this task was from the get-go. This is a book of disconnected short stories. Trying to string it into one consecutive story whilst maintaining detail was just never going to work. In this case, a video game adaptation simply worked better for the story. A Witcher TV show could work in theory, but the story would have to be rewritten from the ground up. I'll also mention that this show is a prime example of character beautification. I mean, look at how hot they made him. Holy shit. Henry Cavill may have been created in a lab to be the best looking man possible, and Yennefer literally gets beautified, but that's part of the story, so I can't really complain. So to conclude, obviously The Witcher had to make some changes to its source material, right? All adaptations do. But similarly to the Harry Potter films, there's a lot to like about this show. I myself already said that an unfaithful adaptation isn't necessarily bad. I had a whole segment about The Shining saying just that. Well, the reason I view The Witcher as a mixed adaptation, whereas I view The Shining as a great one, is because The Shining movie was going for an intentionally different vibe from the books, and all the changes made skillfully reflected that. And above all else, the movie is great. Whereas the changes made to The Witcher feel like they were made a little bit more unwittingly. The writers forced to streamline everything for time and create some episodes that are a little bit ham-fisted. In fact, a lot of the adapting that's actually done could be better in this show. The only reason that I don't view this as a downright bad adaptation is because of the moments when the original story shines through here and there, or things that don't have to do with adaptation at all, like the acting or the visuals. The soul of the original work is damaged, but the product is entertaining enough that there's still value to the adaptation existing. The film adaptation of George Orwell's 1984 is in a similar category for me. I like a lot of things about it. It looks great, it's stylized, and the acting is superb, especially from John Hurt. But so much richness from the original Orwell novel is lost. For instance, Winston's cynical thoughts. It's much more difficult to gauge Winston's thoughts towards Big Brother in the film than it is in the books, where his complex and intrinsically human thoughts are detailed for us. In the book, we know that Winston is essentially dead inside at the beginning, with merely one small spark of hope left within him. We also know that this spark of hope is completely and absolutely snuffed out at the end of the story. In the film, his cynical nature is much more difficult to gauge as a viewer, because we only see his actions and not his thoughts. Another element lost in the film is the manifesto that Winston reads. Sure, it's revealed to be complete bullshit within the confines of the story, but goddamn was there some super interesting political philosophy contained within the stretch of that book. Unfortunately, it obviously wouldn't have been very easy to translate over to the screen without having Winston just read the whole thing out loud, but I don't think it should have been cut entirely. Again, the film is inferior to its source material, but the soul is still carried over. I would say the same for the Life of Pi film, which removes important characterization from Pi's character, especially in his early life. I'm not the biggest fan of that book in the first place though, so I don't have much to say on that topic. I wish I could say anything positive about the next few films, but I can't. Alright guys, we've made it to the fun part. Now it's time to see what happens when you completely fuck everything up. We'll start with an easy to understand case study into what happens when you try to put no work into your adaptation whatsoever. 1960's Psycho is one of the most influential and beloved horror films of all time. I don't know how it's humanly possible to not know the twist of Psycho, but if you don't, I'm gonna spoil it, so you've been warned. Hitchcock experimented with techniques that were virtually unheard of before while making this movie, whether they be auditory or visual. The movie is so good that they've been making sequels and spin-off shows to it ever since. Rihanna is now part of the official Psycho universe. That's how you know it's a legit universe. Then, in 1998, Good Will Hunting director Gus Van Sant decided to remake the film, except that when he said remake the film, he really meant it. The 1998 version of the film is almost a shot-for-shot replica of the original. The only differences made are ones that make the film worse than the 1960 version. Instead of a creepy black and white aesthetic, the film looks bright and colorful. Odd choice, considering the tone. Certain shots have been altered too. Like, for example, this book from the original is now a Playboy magazine. Step back, Hitchcock, your movie's been fixed. Do you guys remember this classic scene? Isn't this classic scene terrible? You need not worry about it any longer. Gus has fixed it. The final image of the original film is this ugly shot of the car being pulled out of the swamp. You as a viewer know that they're about to find a body in that car, and it leaves you off feeling uneasy. The shot is ugly on purpose because it's meant to leave a bad taste in your mouth. Meanwhile, in Gus's version of the film, we end off on a happy-go-lucky crane shot. But worst of all, the acting has gone from amazing...
Why don't you just get in your car and drive away from here, okay?
Where will you get the money to do that, Bates? Or do you already have it? Socked away.
Shut up! Where's that girl you came here with? Where is she?
To Vince Vaughn.
Why don't you just get in your car and drive away from here, okay?
Where are you gonna get that kind of money? Or do you already have it somewhere?
Shut up!
Away.
Shut up!
Huh? What you did to get
Where's that girl that you came here with?
Whereas Anthony Perkins portrayed Norman to be a character who seemed genuinely trustworthy and sweet at first, his psychopathy slowly revealed throughout the film.
Anyway, I hear the expression eats like a bird. It's really a falsity. Because birds really eat a tremendous lot.
Vince Vaughn's Norman Bates is just weird and creepy from the start, and there's really nothing to untangle about his character at all.
Anyway, I hear that the expression, eats like a bird, is really a falsity, because birds really eat a tremendous lot. My hobby is stuffing things.
And just to add insult to injury, during moments the original was effectively silent, this version adds shitty music.
He had to erase the crime, at least in his mind. He hid the body in the fruit cellar and treated...
What the fuck is this, Revolution 9? The music doesn't mesh with the dialogue at all. That being, when you can hear the dialogue.
The other half is taken over. Probably for all time.
So, in short, if you ever wanted to see what Psycho would have been like if it were an episode of Goosebumps, then Gus has you covered. This film kind of reminds me of those Disney remakes that are coming out right now, which I despise. But you know what? Even the Disney remakes, most of them at least, still change the thing they're adapting. I mean, for the worse, but at least they changed something. Maybe a more accurate comparison would be to Metastases, which is the Colombian shot-for-shot remake of Breaking Bad, except it's bad. All that this version of Psycho does is subtract from the original. So why watch it when you can just go watch the 1960 version? At best, you can make the argument that if the 1960 Psycho didn't exist, this movie wouldn't be that bad because it takes a lot of things that were great about another great movie. But here's the thing. I don't know if you know this, but we, in fact, live in a world where the 1960 Psycho does exist, which means this film is a pile of dog shit. Then you have films like the Hobbit trilogy, which have the opposite problem. Instead of changing nothing, they changed too much. If you want to see this trilogy get ripped apart in greater detail, I recommend Lindsay Ellis's 3-part deep dive. They are some damn fine videos, and you should watch them if you have time. I mean, if you have time for this, you probably have time for that. I mean, to be fair, the concept of a Hobbit trilogy was doomed from the start. These films were trying to stretch out a short children's book into another Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the result is 3 films of pure filler. Uncut, unadulterated filler.
Not every man's brave enough to wear a coal seat.
I mean, for fuck's sake, The Hobbit is already shorter than just one of the Lord of the Rings books by itself. But then to split it into 3 films when it doesn't possess the proper story beats for such a split Ooh boy. This book wasn't even written as an intended prequel to Lord of the Rings, by the way, but just as a standalone bedtime kids book. It was only much later, after the success of The Hobbit, that Tolkien decided to write a much more in-depth and adult-oriented sequel. This means that The Hobbit has practically nothing to do with Lord of the Rings. Tolkien hadn't even intended for the ring to be evil when he wrote The Hobbit. It was just some random magic ring that Bilbo happened to find which helped him in his adventure, but was by no means the focal point of the story. I mean, you can tell just by reading it, Bilbo is in no way corrupted by the ring. Even Frodo didn't manage to pull that one off. We're getting into spoilers for the movies up ahead, but like, I mean, the book came out 100 years ago. What are you doing? In the movies, they added all this stuff to try to make the ring feel more consistent with the way that it is in Lord of the Rings, like Bilbo just going apeshit and killing baby spiders because he's greedy as fuck for the ring. All this added stuff about Bilbo being corrupted by the ring means absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of this trilogy. It just exists to set up a trilogy which was already made 10 years ago. The Hobbit was released about 20 years before the Lord of the Rings books were. Many things that we are familiar with as audiences that are in Lord of the Rings are not in The Hobbit. Gandalf is just honestly a very different character than he would go on to be in the Lord of the Rings books. Hobbit Gandalf is just kind of a lot more of a silly Billy, you know? He fucking infiltrates Bilbo's house and pressures him into going on an adventure with him. Then he just ditches them at one point because he gets bored and wants to leave.
I've had enough of dwarves for one day.
Fellowship Gandalf would never do that, man. So when they were making the movies, their hands were kind of tied. Either they had to accept that things may not line up with Lord of the Rings, or they had to change the source material, and they opted to kind of go halfway down the middle. They tried to add a Gandalf subplot that explains what he was doing when he was absent in the book, which just happens to be hunting Sauron, because they had to insert Sauron into the story to make it feel more like Lord of the Rings, even though he has nothing to do with the actual story at all, and you can cut all of these scenes and it doesn't change anything. Oh, and Saruman and Galadriel are here for some reason. If you just watched An Unexpected Journey, you may already be disconcerted. I mean, it takes them almost 40 minutes to actually leave Bilbo's house. There's all this stuff with Radagast, which is pointless. Martin Freeman is indeed a fantastic casting choice to play Bilbo, but that doesn't make the film's pacing good. But it gets so much worse. The Desolation of Smaug introduces the love triangle between Keely, Tauriel, and Legolas. Legolas is here, by the way.
Eorha. Benogoth. Pedithik.
Ochalavui. Maluvanwia.
Fun fact, this love triangle was forced by Warner Bros. Because they thought romance would improve the film, and it was recorded entirely via reshoots, which is part of why it feels so disconnected and stitched on, because it is literally stitched on.
So I made one stipulation when I agreed to do this job. You cannot write a love triangle for this character. I refuse to do another love triangle, and I was guaranteed he will not be in another love triangle. And then we come back for reshoots a year later, and sure enough, suddenly Tauriel is involved in another love triangle, and I just had to bow to the story and say I had to put myself aside and do what's right.
Aren't you going to search me? I could have anything down my trousers.
Or nothing.
And if you thought the trilogy was bloated already, my friend, you haven't watched further. Once we make it past like 20 more Gandalf cutaways of him doing nothing, the heroes arrive in Lake Town, and this is when the movie decides to stop moving forwards. Like, first there's just one scene of them hanging out in Lake Town with Bard, and then there's another scene, and then there's just scene after 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 scene of just, it just keeps going. Oh, orcs are attacking, and Legolas is here fighting them. Can we please see what the Hobbit is doing? in the film called The Hobbit. I mean, in terms of filler, you'd think it's impossible for it to get worse than this, but that's what someone who hasn't seen Battle of the Five Armies would say. Hey, speaking of the number 5, this movie takes a battle which is 5 pages in the book and stretches it out into an entire movie. An entire movie which is basically just the post-climax of the book. Remember how I brought up how Return of the King cut the scouring of the Shire? Okay, great. So imagine if there was actually a 4th Lord of the Rings movie that was just the scouring of the Shire for 3 hours. I know they say when life gives you lemons, you gotta make lemonade, but I think you guys may have made it a little bit too much lemonade here. Now, the amount of pages that are adapted overall is 72, but that's still amazingly low. To put that into perspective, since the film is 144 minutes, that means 2 minutes per page. The average is around 0.3 minutes per page. There's such a thing as slow pacing. I'm a big fan of slow pacing, and I talked about how The Godfather is a great example of that. It lets the world and characters breathe. I'll tell you what it doesn't have though, 1 hour's worth of scenes where Fredo goes to New Jersey and starts hanging out with Tony Soprano's dad. Because slow as it is, these scenes are actually still moving the story forwards. Splitting this book into 3 films didn't just fuck up the pacing though, it also fucked up the story itself. Now, most films, especially Hollywood ones, are presented in 3 acts. But since this trilogy comprises of 3 films, then that implies there will only be 1 act of the story per film. Now, I know what you're thinking. Lord of the Rings was also originally intended to be 1 book and was only split into 3 at the request of the publisher. It's not like Harry Potter where each book has its own contained structure. So shouldn't the Lord of the Rings movies have had this same issue? Well, no. Just 1 Lord of the Rings book is packed with enough material and conflict that it's a lot easier to forge a 3-act structure out of it than out of a third of The Hobbit. Fellowship of the Ring has a really good 3-act structure. Act 1 sees Bilbo forced to leave the Shire with Sam to begin his adventure. The act ends with Frodo being stabbed, and Act 2 begins in Rivendell with the formation of the Fellowship. It's very common for the 2nd act of a story to end with the death of a mentor figure, and Fellowship has this with the death of Gandalf. And Act 3 sees the climax and dissolution of the Fellowship. An Unexpected Journey has basically nothing to work with though, and Act 1 seems like it goes for almost half the movie, whereas Act 3 is pretty much just a giant extended action sequence. This means that in the films, plot points are forced in so that each movie can follow a typical screenplay structure, even though only a third of the story is being adapted in each movie in the first place. Case in point, Thorin avidly doesn't like Bilbo until this exact moment here in the climax of An Unexpected Journey when Bilbo somehow manages to tackle an orc. Just so that the first movie can end with Thorin finally accepting Bilbo.
Did I not say that you would be a burden? That you had no place amongst us? I have never been so wrong in all my life.
What a happy ending. Look guys, it's a real movie with a plot that follows the plot graph thingy, we promise. Except, oh wait, it feels incredibly forced and tacked on at the last minute. I'm not gonna say Bilbo's a coward, but he's definitely no warrior, he's more crafty. Wouldn't it have made more sense for him to use an ability more innate to his strengths to save Thorin instead of this random artificial charge which makes Thorin instantly love him? Warping the story so that Thorin accepts Bilbo this early means that there's nowhere for their relationship to grow in the next film until they're falling out in the 3rd one. As the films go on, Warner Bros. Struggled more and more to shoehorn in a 3-act structure into a third of a short children's book, which was already very light on detail in the first place. The Desolation of Smaug has a similar problem, except in this case I think it's even more egregious. Now, in the book, Bilbo and the gang accidentally release Smaug upon a nearby town. However, Smaug is shot down by some archer dude who we really don't know anything about, and he dies, and that's pretty much that. But since this has to be an epic trilogy with cliffhanger endings, they decided to end the Desolation of Smaug right after the gang accidentally frees him. And Bilbo says this.
What have we done?
Damn. What an exciting dramatic ending. So we got this trilogy hyping up Smaug as basically the main villain.
He was a fire drake from the north.
Smaug.
The Lonely Mountain.
Aye. The dragon Smaug has not been seen for 60 years.
The dragon has long been on your mind.
Smaug owes allegiance to no one. But if he should side with the enemy, a dragon could be used to terrible effect.
We got this dramatic cliffhanger ending, hyping up a climactic confrontation between the boys and Smaug in the next movie. Except Smaug dies right after this immediately in the book, so the next movie starts with him instantly getting killed in the first few minutes, and the cliffhanger is just absolutely fucking pointless. And it only goes to show how much Peter Jackson and Warner Bros. Had to stretch and warp the story just to make it fit a typical Hollywood feel, with forced climaxes and cliffhangers. And look, I'm all for killing off the main villain of the second part of a trilogy at the beginning of the third part to show how much higher the stakes are now and shit. But it's just very bizarre to hype up how difficult it's going to be to kill Smaug, who's being set up as the main villain for the next film.
What have we done?
And then to kill him in such an anticlimactic way before the title even comes up. After we only got like one real scene with him, which is actually a pretty good scene, I can give credit where credit's due, okay? Saruman, who's killed at the beginning of the extended cut of Return of the King, has already been defeated at the end of the Two Towers, meaning his death doesn't feel like a random anticlimax. And finally, these books have another glaring problem. The Hobbit is just at its core a very childish book. Just the names of the 12 dwarves who are the main characters in these films are Balin, Dwalin, Bifur, Bofer, Bomber, Dori, Nori, Ori, Fili, Kili, Owen, and Glowin. And Thorin. Fucking Balin, Dwalin. And yet these films try to recreate the mature tone of the Lord of the Rings trilogy with source material as immature as this. That is, when they aren't simultaneously including ridiculous over-the-top shit like this. But am I supposed to be taking this seriously? Am I supposed to be genuinely worried about the well-being of these characters after you show me this shit? In the book, a lot of the dwarves are just there to be there and don't have any unique personality at all. But since this has to be a beefy trilogy now, we get all these pointless scenes of the dwarves just talking to each other about stuff.
Can't say I fancy elf-maids myself. That one there's not bad.
That's not an elf maid.
And again, hitting on that tonal inconsistency, since this is a children's book, the dwarves are kind of, very fucking stupid. And in the film, this comes through sometimes. One second they're so dumb that they can't understand Bilbo's third grade level plan to save them from getting eaten.
Not that one. He's infected. He's got worms. They're infested with parasites. It's a terrible business. I wouldn't risk it.
Did he say parasites? We don't have parasites! You have parasites!
And the next second they're spouting very adult wisdom about life to Bilbo like this is a scene from Lord of the Rings. And this isn't even mentioning the love triangle. Putting all this story weight onto dwarves who were only really there in the books so that their name could rhyme with another dwarf is maybe not the best idea. Thorin actually is a character in the book, however, and as such, he is by far the most important dwarf in the trilogy, even though he doesn't look like a dwarf at all. Like, did you seriously just have to make him look like a human? And there's actually a lot of things I like about the character of Thorin.
If more people valued all above gold, this world would be a merry place.
I like that he's a flawed character who gets corrupted by greed in the Arkenstone. Even though that's kind of just a rehash of people getting corrupted by the ring. But you know, we're taking baby steps here. And no, Warner Bros., you can't make it feel like Lord of the Rings just by shoehorning characters from Lord of the Rings in there. If anything, you just make me wish I were watching Lord of the Rings right now. But it didn't have to be this way. In fact, there was a time when it wasn't this way, believe it or not. Originally, the Hobbit trilogy was supposed to be not 3, but rather 2 shorter films helmed by Guillermo del Toro. This would have been so much better. Not only would it have been stylistically distinct from the Lord of the Rings trilogy due to a different director, but let's just be honest, 2 films would have been better than 3 in this scenario. But let's be even more honest, 1 film would have been even better. But still, you know, I'll take 2 over 3, I guess. Also, knowing Del Toro, it's possible that his storyline would have involved Bilbo falling in love with a female orc, and the story would have ended with the 2 of them banging in the ocean. But you know what? That would have still been more interesting than what we got, Warner Bros. But of course, Del Toro walked from the project due to how invasive Warner Bros. Was being in his vision, trying to make it more and more like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. There's really no excuse for why they couldn't make a half-decent Hobbit film. Like, this is a book that you could very easily turn into a good film. I mean, it was never gonna work as 3 meaty Lord of the Rings styled films, but if adapted into one single lighthearted and fun film, the result could have been great. For fuck's sake, short source materials are supposed to be an adapter's wet dream since they're so much easier to adapt than a thick meaty book. Why do you think A Christmas Carol has been adapted so many goddamn times? This is just another classic case of a stupid fucking studio ruining what could have been a good adaptation due to their inability to understand the source material. Oh wow, and that studio in question happens to be Warner Bros. Wow, that's a first. Even Peter Jackson visibly didn't give a fuck when he was working on these films. He was just here for the paycheck, let's be honest. To conclude on a happier note, just because the trilogy was filmed in 3 slices like this doesn't mean you have to consume it in that form. Since this is an issue of too much material as opposed to not enough, there exist countless fan cuts of the trilogy which attempt to trim the fat, and I've heard great things about them. But personally, I've only seen the Cardinal cut. Created by YouTuber Cardinal West, this recut of the trilogy attempts to streamline it into what it should have been originally, 1 film, and it clocks in at approximately 3.5 hours. Since the original runtime of the trilogy was 8 hours, 9 if you're going by the extended runtimes. Yes, they released an extended cut of the Hobbit trilogy because that's really what it needed. This means more than half of the movies have been cut away, and yet the plot still moves fluidly. Essentially, everything that doesn't pertain to Bilbo is gone. Gandalf's side quest, gone. The love triangle, gone. Fucking around in Lake Town, gone. Basically the entirety of Battle of the 5 Armies. Gone. Watching this cut made me appreciate just how much the original Hobbit trilogy doesn't have to do with, you know, The Hobbit. Bilbo feels like he's barely even in Battle of the 5 Armies, and when he is there, he's doing nothing that actually impacts anything. Frodo may be the main character of The Lord of the Rings, but he's not the only character that matters. In that story, the spotlight was shared between many characters, but The Hobbit is not like that. It's just a story about Bilbo. So the movies should be about Bilbo. And even though we spend way less time with him, Thorin's death is much more impactful to me in this form because his story and arc isn't horribly diluted. I see everything from the moment he meets Bilbo to his last breath in one sitting.
Who is this person you pledged your service to? Thorin Oakenshield.
He was my friend.
Now, the Cardinal cut, and honestly all these fan cuts, are far from perfect because obviously they can't reshoot or rescript anything. Many of the non-pacing related issues I discussed earlier still exist, but my god is this cut so much better. A simple story like this is vastly more effective when presented in one piece, and it really goes to show that there was a single good film lying within this trilogy all along. This cut in its current form is, yes, very jagged and very, very far from perfect, but if this is what they'd been pursuing all along, we could have gotten something great. I'll also throw in there that I'm not entirely sure how legal it is to recut a trilogy and put it on the internet for free, so I'm not necessarily condoning you to go watch it, you know? I'm just making you aware of the fact that it does indeed exist. And if you do want to watch it, you should probably already legally own a copy of the trilogy. But let's digress. To make a long story short, Warner Bros. Wanted a fat paycheck. That's the end of the story. Speaking of paychecks, remember high school when you were forced to read The Great Gatsby? Remember how boring the book seemed at first until you decided to actually give it a chance and realized it's pretty good? Remember how your English teacher thought for some reason that Gatsby was secretly a black man? Oh no, that was just my English teacher? Okay. Look, I'm all for progressive interpretations of stories, but I don't get it. This was the 20s. If he were black, everyone would have been being super racist towards him the whole time. It doesn't make any sense. But he was so adamant about it. Explain it, mister. Explain. Well, even if you can't relate, that was my personal experience with F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, a book which tells the story of a man who has all the riches in the world and yet can't find happiness. Spoiler warning again. You'd think it wouldn't be that difficult to adapt a story like this to the screen, right? You know, it's the simple tale of a man who pines after his long-lost sweetheart, so he gets super rich just to flex in front of her, but still gets rejected by her after she hit and runs another woman who loves her current husband, and then he gets shot to death in a pool. Easy. Well, do I got news for you? 5 times this novel has been adapted to film, and 5 times the results have been less than stellar. However, I'm gonna focus primarily on the 2013 attempt to bring these pages to life, starring Tobey Maguire and Leonardo DiCaprio. I hate it. I hate it so much. Before I get into any thoughtful criticism, I just want to say, on a surface level, that this movie's aesthetic is so out of place that it makes me question if I was too hard on the gargoyles and the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Just listen to this soundtrack. Feast your ears upon it.
Tears on the mausoleum floor. Blood stains the Coliseum doors.
Love stupid, I know it.
Look at the editing. Look at it. Why is it so fast? I'm gonna put a sound effect on each cut here.
So after dinner,
I'm not even faintly like
Nick
Rose.
wanted to go on to town, right, Nick? To the Yale Club.
Nicky, stay.
I have to work early.
Nonsense.
There's so much.
Pizza time.
It's just for a drink or two.
And you must be Freddie Mercury. You can theoretically take a story from a different time period and direct it in a modern style. Jojo Rabbit, another adaptation, leaned into that super hard and it worked. But that's partially because of the comedic absurdity of the mismatch between the film's setting and the film's tone. This movie, meanwhile, just feels like it doesn't get the book at all and accidentally fucks up the aesthetic. In the book, constantly waking up hungover in the middle of the day with people you don't know was clearly depicted as being an empty, shitty way of living your life, only employed by Gatsby to mask what he was so dearly missing, real friends or family. But in the movie... Hey, this calls for an epic party time montage. A big loss that the film suffers is the lack of Nick's narration that's in the book. They kind of ham-fistedly throw narration in there occasionally to spout exposition.
This was his opportunity, and he seized it.
But his dry sense of humor from the book is totally gone. In fact, pretty much everything that was humorous or funny in the original book is nowhere to be found, or at the very least butchered in the film. Let me try to spell out how bad the film is compared to the book clearly by comparing scenes. First, we'll read a passage from the book. This is when Daisy announces to Tom that she is leaving him for Gatsby. In response to hearing this, Tom aggressively defames Gatsby in an attempt to win Daisy back over, and Daisy in turn loses confidence in her plan gradually more and more. And then because of this, she gets upset and drives away and goes on to hit Myrtle with Gatsby's car, and then shit happens, and then pool death. It's a hard chapter to read through for several reasons. It's one of the only moments in the book when Gatsby momentarily drops his facade of being a gentleman, even if it's only visible in his facial expression. That unfamiliar yet recognizable look was back again in Gatsby's face. That drugstore business was just a small change, continued Tom slowly, but you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby and was startled at his expression. He looked, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man. For a moment, the set of his face could be described in just that fantastic way. It passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. But with every word, she was drawing further and further into herself. So he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly towards that lost voice across the room. In many regards, this chapter is just as much about Daisy as it is Gatsby and the strong conflict within her. It's sad to see the manipulative control Tom has over her, as much of a dumbass as he may be. But above all else, this is when it becomes apparent to readers that Gatsby can never be with Daisy, no matter how desperately he may try. Both of them have changed far too much in the years since he met her. This is the point of the green light metaphor. You listening, English teachers? I expect extra marks for this. Gatsby reaches for a distant light across the water which he can never actually hope to reach. The light, much like Daisy, will always be just out of his grasp. Also, this chapter contains a line which thoroughly destroys my old English teacher's theories. Tom starts being super racist, you know, as he does, and then Jordan says, if I remember correctly, my English teacher was convinced that Jordan was being sarcastic or something. I don't remember, man. He lives atop a bed of lies, what can I say? That being said, let's see how the film depicts this hugely important moment.
You see, we were born different. A girl like this. You shut up! Shut up! You shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
Gatsby looked in that moment as if he had killed a man.
Okay, well, I guess it was just a little bit too subtle in the book. Gotta dumb it down for everyone. Gatsby may be a swindler, but he's not prone to physical violence. He's not a ruffian. And it's not like they were trying to significantly change his character from the book to make him hot-headed, at least not at any point before this. So it just comes completely out of left field. Not only is this not something Gatsby would ever do, but it's just so fucking unintentionally funny. But most importantly, this version of the scene implies that the only reason Daisy turns against the idea of running away with Gatsby is just because of this exact moment here when he loses his cool.
None of this has any consequence. Daisy, talk to me, darling. I just lost my temper, that's all.
With every word, Daisy was drawing further and further into herself.
In the book, it's clear that this was always a pipe dream, destined to never actually come true because it couldn't. Daisy slowly realizes that subtly, underneath his facade, Gatsby just isn't the same man he used to be. But here, it's like, oh, if he just hadn't tried to beat the shit out of Tom, then maybe they could have been together after all. Green light metaphor be damned. It was within his reach all along. Man just had to keep his cool, I guess. Aw shucks. I do kinda like the movie's cinematography. I'll give it that. If you really want to watch a movie from 2013 where Leonardo DiCaprio becomes super rich and then loses everything, go watch Wolf of Wall Street. The flaws that cause his downfall are actually woven into his character in that movie. I realized when I was editing this that Wolf of Wall Street also uses Kanye music in the trailer.
So follow me, you could about to go.
Why are these movies both mirror images of each other? Okay. The Great Gatsby sucks because the filmmakers didn't know what the fuck they were doing. The Hobbit sucks because it's way too long, which is actually a rare issue for film adaptations. What if we took a look at a more common case of an adaptation sucking because it's way too short, amongst other things? What I am about to show you, you will need to be prepared for. Nothing we have discussed thus far today can even compare to the level of ineptitude that this film displays in trying to capture its source material. It may just be the worst adaptation of all time. Its name? The Last Airbender by M. Night Shyamalan. God save us.
Whether I make a movie idea or not, whether it's mine or anybody's, it has to have a sticky quality to it, you know? And if it has a stickiness, then I go, oh yeah.
What have M. Night Shyamalan done?
Yeah, so this is a 3-parter now. I know it was supposed to be 2 parts, but the studio thought it'd make more money if it was a trilogy. So, you know, what can you do? Also, there's gonna be a love story in the next episode, so keep your eyes peeled for that.